Hi, welcome to Lecture 1, Part 3. This is the Education in the U.S. overview. So to begin, for this video, and most of you who have taken courses with me before, there will be no video. I'll actually turn off the video camera soon. But this overview serves as a summary of both of the two articles. The first article really kind of captured a really great summary of all of the movements or the major movements of the education system and the development of American education, the American education system that you may know, but I wanted to make sure we understood, because you'll see how the impact of the idea of American education developed, and then how that transitioned into where we are today, and how the transition into where we are today is still being impacted with what we currently do in our schools. So I do have additional resources if you like them. I had to take a course on this, a part of my PhD, so I have plenty of readings that I can send to you free if you are really curious about this. So the way that these lectures work, if you're new to my lecture style, some will have audio with video and some will not. This one will be one that will not, and we'll just walk through the content together. You'll see some things that come on the screen as we journey through both of the two articles. I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. I'm working in a new 10 slide minimum, so as best practices for online lecturing. So anywho, you should have been able to pull up Article 1 and Article 2. They are in two locations. The first location is within the actual module. The second location is within our resources Padlet, which will have every single thing that I've mentioned to you, including the PowerPoints, and uploaded into that system, because I wanted to make sure you can access those things after. Okay, so the two articles for this lecture discussion will be Article 1, what were the original goals and purpose of the American education system by Phil Whitmore. And then the other article is a USA Education in Brief. So it's like a overview of the U.S. education system in more detail. But the first one was pretty much a survey. So in the first one, you'll see that the goals and purposes of the educational system have been debated for a long time. We started off in a variety of different places where people of high profile, people who were considered theorists and scholars, created the notions that became what we call public education. In the United States, tax-supported public institutions of elementary, secondary, and higher learning have replaced the early system of private or religious schooling. So the original purposes were self-reflective or group self-reflective, and highlighted areas of the private sector and also religious purposes. The idea of a universal K through 12 educational system available free of charge to all citizens was slowly implemented, and it did take a lot of time, because when we talk about universal education or K through 12, we do think about everyone, but everyone was not included. And then as populations began to change where they live and migration happened, and different notions started to become more important, you saw a lot of changes. So let me just bring this over here really quickly. So this is the article that I'm referring to. It was a really brief one. I thought it was important. It starts off with the colonial history, and it's a brief read on purpose because I didn't want to overwhelm you the first week. I remember that feedback at the beginning of the last course. So I've tried to split the main parts of the really critical content at the beginning, the first week and the second week. First part, second part, which The first week is split into 2 parts, so it is over the course of 2 weeks. But to kind of help with going over the colonial period, I do have a video. It's a look back into history. I'll give you that opportunity to look at that on your own. Typically, I do show and play the videos as we are in the course. However, for this course, I'm only going to play a small snippet of it. So you can watch the rest of it on your own time, which is why I added the link. And here we go.
And now we come to the great man himself, a man history records as being instrumental in the creation of America's public education system. Horace Mann was an American educator who served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, part of the American Congress. Horace Mann was the key reformer of the education system at the time. In 1837, he became the head of the newly created Board of Education in Massachusetts, where he began the work that would eventually earn him the title as the Father of American Public Education. After reading through the educational models of different countries, Mann finally hears about a particularly successful style that had been developed in Prussia, which is now modern-day Germany. The Prussian system had shown to be such a success for the government's purposes that, accompanied by a few other educators, Horace Mann travels to Germany to investigate. Upon their return to the United States, they lobbied heavily to have the Prussian model adopted.
All in favor, say aye.
Interest in Prussia had also been growing in the northern half of the continent. Around this time, the Canadian Superintendent of Schools, Egerton Ryerson, traveled to Prussia in search of a new model of education. His journeys also included visiting Horace Mann in Massachusetts to further examine the system he would eventually adopt. George Brown, the editor of Toronto's Globe newspaper, was even quoted saying that Ryerson had successfully imported Prussian education into Ontario. During the next 30 years or so, a whole line of American dignitaries came to Germany to earn degrees. Interestingly enough, those who earned degrees in Germany came back to the United States to staff all the major universities.
Okay, I will let you finish watching that on your own, but I wanted to kind of give you a brief overview of some post and pre and post things occurring during the creation of public education. So remember that public education was a creation. It started off in Germany, but it was a creation based on notions of what the state thought or governmental groups felt that was relevant to our actual population. Previously, public education, it wasn't public, it was private, as it stated in the previous slide. It was based in religious aspects, covered briefly in a colonial history, mentioned in the article. And then by the 1840s, educational reformers pushed for the goal of establishing a free public education system open to children of all genders and social classes. And this first school was nothing really like we have today. Then the first publicly paid for secondary schools of the 1600s were Latin grammar schools geared for preparing students from wealthy families to enter Harvard College, America's first institution of higher education, which was covered in that video. So over the last, I would say from the colonial period all the way into about the 1900s, education went through a huge transformation. The transformation included the creation of the different levels of what we see in education today, and the purpose behind it start to change. So it went from the religious and teaching of the colonial life to theoretical, critical, and vocational purposes behind teaching. The progressivism period, as the population grew from diverse in the 1890s, progressive principles of education began to take hold. So you'll see here with these different movements, smaller versions of the different purposes. I hope that kind of helped you get into this, because this is a lot more detailed. So By the mid 20th century, the idea of universal education from kindergarten through high school had become a reality for substantial numbers of Americans, but certainly not for all, especially the nation's racial minorities. So, as colonialism occurred, as we progressed as a society, as public education began to become what it is and what we see today, the aspects of racial minorities and also integrating education policies and procedures for different groups of people was a problem then and is still a challenge now. So we've gone from different models that started off with basic skills to how do we then create excellence? What does it mean to get an education? What are some of the things that people need to know? So at the beginning of our era, it really was about, or the beginning of public education, it really was about creating basic skills. So students were assessed on, basic math and arithmetic and reading skills and taught how to be good citizens. After a few changes, I would say towards the late 1900s, especially with the creation of larger public schools, K-12 organizations, you saw a lot of changes and a lot of the rise of public education, which brought into question how do we seek educational excellence for everyone, and what does that mean? So that also meant addressing challenges that we were facing as a public education as public education entities with regards to disabilities and serving those students who did have a disability within an education setting. Previously, they were not in inclusive settings, and then with the mandates that passed during the 1990s and then 2004, there were a lot of changes. Also, multicultural, racial aspects in the I think it was the 1900s, yes. The exact 1946, I believe, or 1964, started the Civil Rights Acts, and the movements then required equal learning areas and learning standards, and also integrating multicultural aspects into education. So really, I've covered like a whole bunch of centuries in one, but I tried to not overwhelm you with the basics. But if you have time, which you should this week, to read over the briefing, it's about 28 pages, but it's really interesting. So what we've come to now is changing from religious to citizenship teachings into the war on education, which was in the early 1900s or the late 1900s, when our President Bush, stated that we were really behind as in comparison to the rest of the nation. You saw the birth of seeking educational excellence. So you'll see that during your reading. But in particular, the movement for what is sometimes termed excellence in education has taken many forms. One set of changes emphasizes a back to basics or core curriculum focused on math, science, history, and language arts. And then most elementary and secondary schools also provide so-called gifted and talented programs for high-achieving students. So you saw the separation of required content areas, and also the development of AP, IB courses, and also gifted education. That development started with that purpose in mind of seeking educational excellence. Here, little breakdown in 1983, a highly, so this is the nation at risk I was talking about, where rigor became the focus, and then that birthed what you see now, the call for education excellence. The most sweeping change was this. I think they were two parts. So 1965, the role of the government was different. So I think that's something important for you to understand, because once our president announced that there was a nation at risk, there was a war on education, and that we needed to make changes, that birthed what you saw in the No Child Left Behind in 2001. And then that beget or resulted in what we have today, which is Common Core regulations, and then each state was able to adapt them if they wanted to have funding. So a lot of the changes that you saw or that you read about, that you read, have a lot to do with once governmental aids or funding became a part of the education system, it changed what that meant. It also changed accountability. It changed what we test, why we test. So I don't know if you remember, but when I was younger, during third grade, you did not have assessments. Now you have the pre-assessment time, especially on the East Coast, where students are expected to take that end of course exam starting all the way into elementary school. Because why? A lot of it has to do with state funding as well as placement within high schools now. So a lot of this started out of this. Once they issued a nation at risk, which some people refute the claims in the report, it then started us on our progression towards No Child Left Behind, or should I say seeking excellence, which birthed other notions that we ascribe to today as standards and requirements in education. Over time, education in America has come to represent universal free public education for all. So we've moved where we are today. We see more of, especially in different parts of our state, where education systems really strongly stress the need to integrate inclusive educational practices as well as differentiate in order to meet the needs of all diverse learners. Education, moreover, is seen as the primary means to succeed in a society that seeks to replace the claims of inherent privilege for those of individual freedom and equal opportunity. So now it is after the mandate that students have to go to school. This is a route into being successful in our society, unlike in Finland, where they have primary school and then students have two different pathways, university or into vocational work, and it's at a younger age, which is not the case here. Students here have to go through K through 12 in order to go into the next step of their life. The American classroom of the 21st century scarcely resembles that of a few decades ago, much less the schoolhouse of a past century. Yet the role of American education in binding together a growing and diverse nation endures, transmitting the lasting values of freedom and human dignity from one generation to the next. I will tell you that it's interesting to see the history if you want to explore. Again, like I said, I do have resources, but exploring where we came from and how where we came from impacts how we see education today is super interesting, because older philosophers felt that, theory and practice, the Dewey method is still in our classrooms today. But there were so many schools built on the Dewey mindset, and now his theory on students being able to co-construct their knowledge is seen throughout a lot of different things that we call as cooperative learning. So the impact that some of these philosophers had is extreme to our current practices that we have today and what we see as the notion of learning and of education. So I leave you with this thought, why it matters. Education today, so all of our methods of assessments and grading relate to the previous purposes behind education. It has taken us a while to meet the diverse needs of all students and also to recognize the intellectual strength of all students and cultures. It also has taken us a while to be able to implement educational practices that best suit the needs of all learners, but the truth of the matter is that we've been working at this for a while. And when I say we, I mean as a nation, education has been a focus point for a very, very, very long time. And the changes that have been made, I think, have been beneficial to a certain extent to all students, and I think that will become and continue to get better as long as we keep students at the center. But this is a little quick overview. If you would like more detail after reading the brief, please let me know. I do actually have readings for each of the key contributors to the creation of public school education. I think that wraps us up for this. I hope you enjoy the reading, and hope you have a great day.